Hi, my name is Richard Menkis, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 5th episode of Meet the Author, presented by the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. Our featured author today is David Koffman, who is joining us to discuss his highly significant new work, The Jews, Indian, Colonialism, Pluralism, and Belonging in America. Before I tell you more about David and introduce our special guest interviewer, Professor Paige Raibmon, a few words about the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. The association is the only academic society dedicated solely to the study of the Canadian Jewish experience. Our organization is multidisciplinary and we encourage interdisciplinarity. We publish the annual journal Canadian Jewish Studies, Interviewee Canadien. We also publish a newsletter twice a year and hold an annual conference. Because of the COVID pandemic, we canceled our last conference and decided to inaugurate our online events. In addition to this Meet the Author series, we are organizing a number of online sessions. Our first session broadcast in July was on harassment and hate online, realities and remedies. It is available for viewing on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to that channel to find out more about our upcoming events. At the end of the interview, you will also find information about the association, and we strongly encourage you to join the association and to support its mandate to deepen our understanding of the Canadian Jewish experience. You will also find information there about ordering David's book with a discount code. So it's now my pleasure to give a proper introduction to our two guests. Professor Paige Raibmon is a professor of history at the University of British Columbia and editor of BC Studies. She is a settler scholar who grew up on the unceded ancestral territory of the Musqueam people, where she lives and works today. She is the author of Authentic Indians, Episodes of Encounter from the Late 19th Century Northwest Coast, and is co-author of Written as I Remember It, Teachings from the Life of a Sliman Elder, and most recently, co-author of the digital open source multimedia book, As I Remember It, Teachings from the Life of a Sliman Elder. Paige, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Richard.
David S. Koffman holds the J. Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry and is an associate professor in the Department of History at York University. His published work has appeared in volumes of collected essay and in journals such as the Journal of American Ethnic History, Contemporary Jewry, and Canadian Jewish Studies. His newest book project, an edited volume entitled No Better Home, Jews, Canada, and the Sense of Belonging, will be published by the University of Toronto Press later this fall. He serves as editor-in-chief of the journal Canadian Jewish Studies, Études Juives Canadiennes. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Richard. Happy to be here.
And I will be the other interviewer. In addition to serving as the co-organizer of this series of online events with Jesse Toufexis of the University of Ottawa, I'm an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of British Columbia with a research focus on the cultural and social history of Canadian Jewry. So, okay. The introductory spiels are over. We can finally get into our conversation, which I'm so much looking forward to. David, could you start by telling us a little bit about yourself, where you were born, where you grew up, where you studied, and what drew you to this topic?
Sure. Well, I was born and raised in Toronto, where I am again now. And let's see, I went to McGill for my undergraduate degree. I did anthropology. I came back to Toronto and did a master's in anthropology in Toronto. And then I took a few years away from the academy. I went to Jerusalem for a little while. And then I made my way to New York to do a few rounds of graduate work in public policy and a Judaic Studies master's. And then I did a PhD at NYU in the History and Judaic Studies departments, a joint double master's degree or double PhD program, whatever it's called. And then did a postdoc for a couple of years in Toronto, and then landed this job at York University, where I've been for the past 7 or 8 years. What drew me to the project? I had planned on doing a PhD in anthropology, and was hoping to do something about the history of the kind of Jewish, to have the history of anthropology intersect with modern Jewish history. and to think and speak about why the Jewishness or how the Jewishness of these early pioneer anthropologists may have mattered to their study. But no anthropology department wanted me. They said that this kind of project was reserved for senior scholars and that one had to cut their teeth at field work to do an anthropology PhD. So I moved over to history. And as I was starting to think about formulating this project, there was a kind of unfortunate and gruesome anti-Semitic incident, verbal incident. It wasn't that physically gruesome, but an incident with former AFN national chair, David Ahenecue, who made some anti-Semitic remarks, and the Canadian Jewish community was quite alarmed and sprung into action about it. And I thought, oh, wait, here's a kind of situation where I have one interesting kind of contemporary case of a Jewish First Nations encounter that has to do with anti-Semitism, and another case of these anthropologists of a century ago, a little less than that, who spent their careers studying Native American, other indigenous tribes, and kind of built their careers on thinking about Native American culture. And I thought, well, maybe I can go a little bit more broadly and ask some questions about where and when Jews and indigenous people may have interacted, and what kind of traces are there of those interactions in the archives. And that set me off on the path that eventually became the dissertation. And then a few years later, after significant revisions and some additions, the book that we're talking about today.
Thank you. And I know that Paige wants to follow up on this and a number of other issues. So I'm gladly turning it over to Paige. Go ahead.
Thanks. I also want to just start by saying thank you for the invitation to take part. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. David, I really enjoyed your book. And the comments you were just making kind of lead nicely into the first question I wanted to ask you, which is sort of about the broad sweep of the book. And your work, especially in the early chapters, reminds me of Theodoria's book, Playing Indian, in certain ways, about the ways in which it did certain kinds of work for Jews and their own identity making to interact with or to imagine indigenous peoples. And I wondered if you could talk about the ways in which these Jewish uses, it is kind of a use, manipulation of their fantasies about indigenous peoples, the ways in which they were similar to and different from those of non-Jewish white Americans.
Sure. It's a great question. I would say that first and foremost, it really matters when we're talking about. So the opening gambit of the book is a story that I don't get into in too much detail, but it's about the claim that Native Americans descended from the lost tribes of Israel. So the Jewish connection to this claim that American Indians and Jews shared a kind of ancient identity is obviously makes the Jewish intervention into this debate that a lot of Americans are interested in talking about and thinking about. Are the American Indians descendants of the lost tribe quite different from, say, the Christian missionaries or the theologians, or even the geographers and ethnographers who are interested in championing this claim for different reasons. In the early chapters, like you mentioned, where I focus on the mid to late 19th century and early 20th century frontier life, Jewish ideas about American Indians are pretty similar to most whites in the most important ways. You know, they share a myth that the land is free of any claim, that the space and physical land and its resource of America have economic and potential, or economic and political, like redemptive potential. They can really do something for the people of the nation. They have ideas about so-called Indians' evolutionary inferiority and the kind of classic combination of their bloodthirst and heroic, this sort of whole heroic and savage mix. They share some racial assumptions too. But the differences and the similarities are really important, because I think Jews in the most important ways are to be understood as whites, and certainly settlers in this period. The differences, though, are a couple. One, they generally lack an impulse to sexualize Native Americans, as you often see in some of the white literature, especially. This doesn't appear in the historical record. they're far less interested in acquiring large tracts of land and land ownership than a lot of the other white population is on the frontier. And of course, they lack the missionary impulse. They don't see Indians as potential converts, which is one of the kind of central arenas in which face-to-face encounters happen with indigenous people. There are other times, though, too, later in the immigration and race debates of the teens and 20s and 30s, it was pretty muddled. And in this case, indigenous people are a very useful foil for all immigrant communities, which is similar to how Italians or Greeks or Irish or Ukrainian immigrants spoke about native peoples, but very unlike the so-called old stock white Americans. So this is a kind of similarity difference with a different bunch. And then still later in the 40s and 50s and 60s, where the study for this book stops, the Jewish perspective was different in that certain Jews, or the activist kind of progressive left anyway, see a connection and a shared history of persecution with indigenous people. But now they speak on behalf of American ideals and speak, sort of to American power, and in some cases as American power, given their positions in the Roosevelt administration.
Yeah, that's I find that sort of just that survey of those similarities and differences really interesting. And maybe I think I'll ask you now really about that latter part of the book, since you're kind of segueing into it so nicely. And I was also interested to hear in your own introduction that the history of that chapter, I guess it's chapter 6, the chapter about the anthropologist, and how that was sort of the kernel of your project long before you went to your PhD program, that you had this idea. And, for me, that's the chapter that really sings in your book. And I wanted to say also that it sort of gave me a new sense of my own intellectual trajectory in a way that maybe I never thought about it, or maybe I just forgot. I'm not really sure. I've been thinking about it since I read the book. So my own grandfather came from Kishinev, and my father grew up in a Yiddish speaking household in Toronto, actually. But I grew up here in Vancouver, really cut off from Jewish community for the most part. And what struck me was, just like some of these anthropologists who you write about, I started off like writing every single university paper I had any option on about Jews in Russia, Jews in France, Jews in Germany. And at some point I traded that off for studying indigenous peoples. And at the time I thought, oh, I'm interested in persecuted peoples. This is my thing. This is what I'm going to do. But I'd really forgotten about that connection for myself until I read your book. And then I found it really interesting that you're kind of situating a story that's similar for some of these anthropologists who had varying relationships to their own Jewishness. So that's my personal relationship to your story. I just really appreciated it for that. It seems to me, I'm really fascinated that the anthropology departments didn't want this, because it seems to me like this is a story, the Jewishness of anthropology and how it mattered has just been staring the discipline in the face for a long time. Like once I read it, I was like, of course somebody needed to do this. So I love that you draw that out. And I just wanted to ask you to maybe share now what your core argument is there about this relationship between the Jewishness of these anthropologists, and how you think it refigures the history of anthropology specifically.
Sure, I'll do that. But before I do, let me just say that I kind of have a flipped trajectory, in that as an anthropology student in my undergraduate and my first round of master's, I was, I studied what anthropologists study, which were various, like, non-Western cultures. And that was my, I kind of absorbed the intellectual lessons of anthropology, in a nutshell, that culture shapes people, in profound ways. And only after I had years of absorbing that intellectual perspective did I switch to thinking about, okay, well, how might I have been shaped by modern Jewish history? And then I ended up coming sort of back to this sort of version of twinning them. But Funny. Anyway, the core argument for this chapter is that that the history of anthropology fits into modern Jewish history as well, and American Jewish history in particular, and that the Jews who pioneered the American version of the field did so with a Jewish horse in the American race, as it were. They developed the idea of cultural relativism and the anti-racist discourse that they promoted to white audiences by studying American Indians for the most part. There were a few anthropologists in America who went abroad, and unlike in France and in Britain, the American discipline was a kind of backyard one, and it had subjects that it believed to be, elemental or primitive subjects, like that you could study and make claims about all of humans. So it kind of studied American Indians, but it made these anti-racist and anti-racial claims that were clearly of benefit to those Jewish communities themselves. So I call it ventriloquism in the book, and the evidence that I gather for this is from the private archival papers of these individual anthropologists, which I believe show that their sustained interest in activism for Jewish causes and for Native American causes from these anthropologists, shows that they had this political or ethical agenda that was at least in part motivating and dovetailing with their professional writings, even though they never wrote about their Jewishness in their professional in their published records. How does it refigure the history of anthropology? I don't know. I mean, I suppose it's part of a larger discussion that anthropology has been having really since the 90s about putting the anthropologist back in anthropology. I think this, the Jewish part has to be an element, given that there were so many Jews who are sort of overrepresented in the first two generations of professional anthropology under Franz Boaz, and sort of generation or really two of children of immigrants and immigrants themselves, which was a very important pivot point for anthropology to, its current and more or less current form, and very different from the anthropology that existed in museums and was based on an evolutionary model, the one that kind of was put into the academy had this overrepresentation of Jews, so it just has to be considered.
Yeah. So you mentioned Boaz, and I actually wanted to ask you a little bit about him too, because when I started the book, I was like, oh, there'll be a chapter on Boaz, a whole big piece. And there's not. Certainly you talk about him, but he's not the generation that you're really focused on. And I really appreciate hearing, many anthropologists whose work I know, who I don't think I quite realized they were all Jewish, like all of them, name after name. I was like, oh yeah. So, but it seems to me, in a way, you decenter Boaz, who's really as you acknowledge in the book, that he's the foundational figure of the discipline in its current form, as you just said too, in so many ways. And I just wondered if you had any comment, or if you wanted to talk about that decision to decenter him a little bit. I could think of lots of reasons to do that, but I'm curious what your relationship was to that.
Well, I'll go first, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts. There's a lot that's been written on Boaz, and including a small sort of sub-literature on the Boaz shelf about Boaz's Jewishness. Incidentally, there is also a discussion about anthropology's Jewishness and the sort of Jewish problem in anthropology. That's a pretty interesting literature, and it's not just American. It deals with Claude Lévi-Strauss and some of the both French and British actually anthropologists. I suppose that the fact that there was such a big bookshelf, I didn't want to weigh into an extended debate about Boaz, because I wanted to show something about, make a point about aggregation, about that this is the kind of not just an intellectual history of a given thinker, which would sort of force me to engage in a debate that's already happened, that's already happening about the extent to which his Jewishness impacts his anthropology, because I thought that it would it would undermine my larger case. I mean, I didn't want to write about, I didn't want to add to the Boaz bookshelf. I wanted to add to the bookshelf that is very slim at the moment about Jews and indigenous people. So except for Felix Cohen, a character that receives, a good chunk of one chapters, nobody really gets more than a page or two. And I thought that by focusing on a whole cohort, I could make some broader claims that I wanted to make. So it was not an intervention into the history of anthropology debates. I sort of leave that to the anthropologists themselves. But as a historian of the Jews, I thought, I can use the plural here instead of having to focus on this significant founding figure, significant though he is.
Yeah, that's great. And that it ties, actually, I'm going to go to the next question, because I think that's a really interesting part of your methodology that stood out for me. Is this, and you say it explicitly towards the latter part of the book, probably sooner too, but it hit me more clearly towards the end, where you say that your goal here is not to come up with a number of individual Jewish heroes that we can lionize, but to think about Jews in the aggregate. And I think that's just a really interesting approach to this book. And could be a gravitational pull towards that other possibility of digging up individuals who people didn't realize were Jewish, perhaps. And I guess I wanted to give you a bit of space to talk maybe just a little bit more than you just did about the significance of thinking about methodologically, I guess, like not just in your book, but as a historian, what's the methodology of thinking about identity, pluralism in the aggregate over individuals?
Sure. So there's a couple things. First of all, much of Jewish history focuses on Jewish institutions and organizations, where it's very obvious that their actions represent and are motivated by communal concerns, however they identify and articulate and fight for those concerns. They obviously disagree with one another about how to do it. But if historians focus only on these explicitly Jewish organizations, then they kind of miss a lot of Jewish life, which has to do with, how Jews are Jewish when they interact with non-Jews, or when they're, in the marketplace, or in their residential patterns, or in their habits or leisure, or anything that kind of really, outside of organizational life. So this story about Jewish indigenous encounters really only begins in the 1980s or later. But the story of their encounters, of course, begins a lot sooner than that, a lot earlier than that. So they seem to be a story of individuals, but I wanted to make the study a story of lots of individuals, and hence the comment about aggregation, and not about representation, not about organizations or individuals or leaders who speak for the community, but kind of ordinary people on the ground. So I think there's the challenge of making claims about the extent to which Jewishness influenced Jewish actors. It's easy to get into the weeds of any individual when you study an individual as an individual. So instead of pursuing the kind of intellectual question of finding influence, which I think has a kind of strange communal project at root wherever it's done. If you do a study on, Jews in the mob, or on baseball or banking or Nobel Prize winning, and instead of finding influence, I want to show context and show conditions and the kinds of forces that make certain thoughts and certain courses of action thinkable or doable, or unthinkable and undoable. And you can't get that, I think, if you focus entirely on individuals. And I also had the surprising pleasure of finding just a ton of sources in a ton of different archives. So while it's good to tell stories about individuals, and they, I think, help books be clearer about what's at stake and what things kind of feel like, I was able to make the broader claims that I was aiming to make by talking about, aggregates or cohorts.
Yeah, I think it works beautifully. It's really great. It's great to hear you explain that a little more. One of the kind of other through lines, really, I guess it's about your methodology that strikes me in this book, is the enormous care and effort you put into being balanced in your account. And there are kind of potential landmines on all sides of your project, potentially, like that I could see you being really careful to say, well, you're not doing this, and you're not doing that. And you both want to insist, as we've talked about, on the difference that Jewishness, or the Jewish context of people's lives made in their relationship to indigeneity and to indigenous peoples. And at the same time, you hold back from lionizing them, and you do quite a bit of work to situate them in the context of the literature that we would call settler colonialism now. The Jews are part of settler colonialism. They're doing that work. Even the anthropologists, so even the advocates, right? That this is part of this broader colonial project that at its root is dispossessing indigenous peoples of their land, of, in many cases, their governance and rights to family. And I guess I wanted to also talk a little bit about that and sort of get a sense about how you felt about navigating that balance throughout, and how you did it.
Right. Well, I came to the topic as a historian of the Jews, and I was not particularly knowledgeable about, or frankly, when I started interested in the history of colonialism. So I didn't have the intervention that I came out with, I didn't have it in mind from the start. I went on a massive fishing expedition to find as many sources as I could, and I think that the conclusions that I drew were born out of the sources, and not something that I had planned on making. You know, I also, I mean, I struggled with this balance. I'm glad that you think I found it. I was, you know, anxious when the book was coming out, and as I was preparing the manuscript, you know, that it would be, you know, that Jewish readers would feel defensive about it and would hate the book for that reason, and that Indigenous studies and Indigenous people, if they read the book, would think I didn't go nearly far enough, and that they would hate the book too. And I don't enjoy that kind of conflict. But some part of me said, oh, if everybody hates the book, then perhaps I'm doing something right. Now, thankfully, I don't think people have been hating the book just yet, or at least not in print. But it was definitely something that I struggled with. I'd also say that I think it turns out that the project of disaggregating whites, the category of white settlers, is important intellectually and politically. And it might even be useful in operationalizing reconciliation efforts, since, you know, very few white people think of themselves as white. Their identity isn't a white person, and very few people think of their kind of primary identity as settlers or part of settler community. Instead, I think people generally see themselves tied to their own ethnic history, their family history, or their religious history, and so it's important for scholars or historians to tie these individual sort of primary identity categories to the forces that help shape them, the powerful forces of, you know, colonialism and settler expansion. And my hope is that other scholars do too, and that we can have, you know, Catholic Indigenous Encounters book, or Italian Indigenous Encounters book, or, you know, every ethnic group, and even racialized minorities like, you know, Chinese and Indigenous Encounters and Black Canadian Indigenous Encounters. I think we'll just do a better job of thinking through the settler side of this history if we do it from categories that are, you know, that make sense to people who have their own connections to history.
Yeah, it strikes me that there's been literature for a long time, going back to some of my early work, about the limitations of these binary categories and how they don't map well onto reality and that they do harm. But we really have not had nearly enough work doing just the kind of thing you're talking about, disaggregating those binaries of white and Indian or whatever they may be, and giving us a language to really talk about these things in more complex, non either or binary terms. So I think that your book makes a real contribution there. maybe, I think I'm going to ask you one more question, and the sky's the limit here. I wanted to ask you what you found most surprising. You talked about this giant fishing expedition you went on, you found all these things, and now you have this book. So when you reflect on it, what surprises you most about the project now that it's done?
Sure, happy to talk about that. Well, I was first surprised that I did manage to find so many sources. I fretted in my early graduate years that I wouldn't be able to find enough to do a dissertation, let alone a book, and had backup plans for alternate dissertation topics that were just totally different from this book. So I was pleased to find so many. And among those sources, I was certainly surprised to find the activists, the civil servants and lawyers, and these social scientists that I spent so much time talking about, and the progressive work that they did. And I was perhaps even more surprised to find evidence of these violent racist Jews on the frontier, the vigilantes who scalped people and made all kinds of violent, gruesome public displays. And it was shocking to read these firsthand accounts, newspapers, memoirs, stuff like that, that describe some of this stuff that I discussed earlier in the book. Let's see. Second, I suppose I was surprised that I would develop an argument about settler colonialism and put that out as a first early major research project, even though I didn't study this in graduate school and hadn't thought that I was interested in it. So this, as I say, sort of emerged from the sources and had a lot of reading to do and a lot of understanding to put into place so that I could make sense of my sources. And that I was surprised, perhaps naively, but I was surprised that this would be, this would be what I was talking about. And lastly, most recently, I've been surprised that it's sort of relevant. When I started the project, I thought it was a kind of quirky, odd back corner of North American Jewish history, and it would be one of those interesting little things. And years on, because the public conversation has taken the turns that it has, and because I've found myself back in Canada, and maybe this was also naive, but it turns out people are interested in thinking about this, like a lot more people than I thought would be from the academic public and the professional public. So that was surprising to me as well.
Okay, thanks so much. Like I said, I really enjoyed the chance to read your book and talk to you about it. Richard, do you have any follow-up final questions?
Well, I'm reluctant to cut short this very rich conversation, but I do have to bring this somewhat to a close, or soon to a close. David, let me just ask you, and it probably flows from some of the last things you were saying to Paige. I know about the volume of collected essays that you've got coming out in the next couple of months, but is this research that you've been talking about, and which has been so significant, continuing on in new directions for you?
Yeah, it is. I've managed to squeeze out a few articles and book chapters. So in the book that you just mentioned, that's coming out in the fall, I have a kind of one chapter argument essay for what Canadian Jewish, First Nations, Indigenous encounters history might look like, and kind of do something like a book might do, but in a much more truncated form that deals with the Canadian material. And I've written about some of the other kinds of Jewish Indigenous encounters that just didn't fit into the framework of the book, although they're clearly connected. One about playing Indian at summer camps, and another almost more sociological piece about what's been happening in Canada with Canadian Jews and Indigenous people in the last 15 years, trying to kind of make sense of a flurry of activity and map some of what's been going on and give some historian's perspective on why it's happening now and how to make sense of it. I hope to be able to expand this into some collaborative projects too, because I think that there are two really interesting ways of moving the material. One is to have more dialogues in writing or in written forums or in discussions of various sorts, conference type things, with other scholars of Canada who are thinking about other subsets of settlers and Indigenous encounters, and what kind of sense we can make of things if we put them in aggregate. I'm also doing some of this conversation with colleagues in the United States. And then secondly, doing some kind of comparative work on the Jewish studies front with Indigenous encounters and Jews globally, because I think there's a similar story and frankly not that much research that's been done on Jewish encounters with Indigenous people in South Africa and Australia and New Zealand and Mexico and the Caribbean and Argentina and lots of places where Jews worldwide migrated from the European and Russian Empire orbit, and they found themselves on those colonial or former colonial settings for a pattern set of reasons, and made similar or at least comparable sets of impacts on the peoples who were already in those places. And I think there might be some interesting, fruitful way of thinking about taking this experience, again, in aggregate and making claims about why it matters for modern Jewish studies more broadly. And if I could, I suspect that the conclusions that we'll come up with are that the categories of modern Jewish history are kind of framing devices, have generally been discussions about emancipation, and then the subsequent kind of dance of integration. How well or at what cost did Jews try to integrate themselves into the communities in which they've become part of? And I think that in a way, this emancipation and integration framework for modern Jewish history is just a little off base. It just doesn't sort of follow the money, and it doesn't follow the people. And I think colonialism might be a more fruitful, large category for thinking about modern Jewish life. And we'd only be able to make these claims if we did do comparative global Jewish history work. And I think that, thinking about Indigenous Jewish encounters might be one wedge into rethinking this much broader modern Jewish history framework.
Thank you. I've read the work you've done so far that's been published, and it's been significant, and I've really appreciated it. And I'm really looking forward as well to the work that's forthcoming. It really will open up new paths in our understanding of Jewish history, and as you say, away from emancipation model, maybe away from always looking at where the Jews were coming from rather than looking at where the Jews actually were, which would very much be what your encounters are about. So I'm going to have to wrap it up. David, this has been wonderful. Thank you so very much for doing this.
Thank you for organizing it, Richard and Jesse, who's not on screen. And Paige, thank you so much. It was really wonderful speaking with you and great questions. I hope we get to continue our conversation as well.
And Paige, thank you so much for taking the time to be a guest interviewer. As I said before, it was a very rich and enlightening conversation.
Thanks for the invitation. I really enjoyed it. It was fun.
Okay, so thanks again to the two of you. My name is Richard Menkis. Please keep watching so that you can find information about joining the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies and to get ordering information and a discount code for David's book. Again, thank you all for watching and stay healthy.